So we'll start in about a minute. I see the attendees coming in.
Otherwise, you can see their names, Linda, if you go to the right, you know.
Okay, I'm going to begin. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another session of RebPsych 2020. This year, our theme is Decolonizing Mental Health. I thank you all for joining us. I am Flavia D'Souza, a recent graduate of the Yale School of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry Residency Training Program, and was a part of the RebPsych organizing committee while I was a trainee. I have an adjunct position at Yale and I'm on faculty at Howard University. Our transcriptionists, Christy and Christine, will provide closed captioning this evening. Kyle is our technical guru and ensures that our webinar will run smoothly. Thank you to you all. We will post the instructions on how to access live captioning to the chat room. Thank you. I would like to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Scaticock, Golden Hill, Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinn-Nepiac and other Algonquin speaking peoples have for generations stewarded the lands and waterways of what is called the state of Connecticut. We will honor and respect that enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. The acknowledgement is but one step, recognition, in the larger process of decolonization. This educational series aims to broadly explore decolonizing mental health, both in theory and practice. Last week, we experienced and discussed the role of music in alleviating and improving mental health, and even further in decolonizing our mind and our health systems. We will paste the link so that you can access materials from the previous session, and so you can sign up for our 2 upcoming sessions. Videos and transcripts will be posted online. I am thrilled to introduce Jody Leader and Linda Luz Alterman, who will present to us today. The title is Decolonizing the Psychoanalytic Space, a study dialogue group on structural racism and whiteness for psychotherapists. Jody Leader is a dancer, social justice activist, philanthropist, and a psychologist and psychoanalyst in private practice in Brookline, Massachusetts. She works with adults and couples. She is a graduate and faculty member at the Massachusetts Institute for Psychoanalysis. Linda Luz Alterman is a graduate, supervisor, and faculty member at the Massachusetts Institute for Psychoanalysis and lecturer in the Department of Psychiatry, Harvard Medical School in Boston. She is a psychologist and psychoanalyst in private practice in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and co-facilitates study dialogue groups on structural racism and whiteness. We will hear from the presenters first and have time for questions and answers at the end. We have a feedback form that we will share in the chat room. Your thoughts and ideas about our programming are important to us. Please feel free to use the Q&A and chat functions for questions and discussions. For our discussion, please be mindful to take space and make space. Use I statements to speak to your specific experiences rather than use generalizations. And be thoughtful in your storytelling. Avoid detailing specific instances of distress or violence that may be re-traumatizing to other participants. Thank you. I'm going to hand it over to Jody and Linda at this time.
Thank you so much, Flavia. We so appreciate your help in the days leading up tonight and your facilitation with this presentation. So to start, my name is Jody Leader. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a white, straight, cis woman with short curly brown hair and orange rimmed glasses. I'm wearing a gray long sleeve sweater and a scarf. And behind me is a dark colored wall with some art on it.
My name is Luz Alterman. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a cisgender white woman with short dark hair and red rimmed glasses. I'm wearing a black sweater with red and pink roses on it, and I have a salmon colored wall behind me.
I acknowledge the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts as the custodians of the traditional lands I live and work on, and recognize that their sovereignty was never ceded. I pay my respects to elders past, present, the 7 generations yet to come, and to their culture, as well as to their continued connection to land and community.
I acknowledge the Massachusetts and Pawtucket people from whose land I am speaking today. I acknowledge and respect their rich traditions and histories, as well as those of the many Indigenous people from different nations who work and live in this region today. I'm going to start with opening words as we typically start our study dialogue groups when we meet. My opening words are from Frantz Fanon. He writes, quote, "Decolonization, which set out to change the order of the world, is clearly an agenda for total disorder, but it cannot be accomplished by the wave of a magic wand, a natural cataclysm, or a gentleman's agreement. Decolonization, we know, is a historical process. In other words, it can only be understood, it can only find its significance and become self-coherent insofar as we can discern the history-making movement which gives it form and substance," end quote. And this is from The Wretched of the Earth. We want to acknowledge that decolonization is serious, that as Tuck and Yang state in their article, decolonization is not a metaphor. They state, quote, "Decolonization brings about the repatriation of Indigenous land and life. It is not a metaphor for other things we want to do to improve our societies and schools," end quote. At the same time, in the spirit of the title of this conference, we are using the term to describe what we set out to do in our study dialogue groups, exposing and making explicit what has been unspoken and unseen, although often in plain sight, the brutal history of this country that begins with the genocide of the Indigenous people who were living on this land, the theft of that land, and the kidnapping of African people who were brought to this hemisphere to work the land that had been stolen for the purpose of making money for the white people who took the land. We don't believe that this undertaking of making the hidden and implicit apparent is a simple or straightforward process. It is not, and we see that in the responses of the many members of our groups who are engaging in a deep personal experience of self-examination and reconsideration of everything they have been taught about American history and their world. We are unpacking whiteness, making whiteness visible along with the internalized, implicit white supremacist beliefs and assumptions that go with that.
So we're here tonight to tell you about a series of study dialogue groups on US structural racism and unpacking whiteness that Linda and I have been co-facilitating at the Massachusetts Institute for Psychoanalysis for the past 3 years. We are grateful to MIP, the Mass Institute for Psychoanalysis, and especially former MIP President Deborah Dowd for believing in us, for supporting our development of these groups and folding these groups into MIP's continuing education offerings. It is notable that MIP has been a white-led organization since its inception more than 30 years ago. Most of the analysts associated with MIP are white. Linda and I have been both participants and facilitators of these study dialogue groups, and we have found them transformative for participants and for ourselves. They have increased our awareness tenfold of structural racism and white supremacy in our country and in our community. These groups are free. They're limited to 12 participants per group and open to all experienced mental health clinicians, not just psychoanalysts. In the fall, we offer the history of US structural racism and its impact on us as citizens, clinicians, and teachers. It's quite a mouthful. In the spring, we offer a group on unpacking whiteness. And you can see how they sort of flow into one another. Most of the people that sign up for both of these groups are white. Each group session is 90 minutes long and meets for 6 sessions spread over 3 months. This fall, the History of US Structural Racism Study Dialogue Group had twice the number of people sign up. So we created 2 sections which meet simultaneously. And Linda's co-facilitating one with Sarah Brady, and I'm co-facilitating another with Tanya Ehrlich. And both Sarah and Tanya are alumni of our groups, and we're so grateful for their ongoing collaboration with us in this project. For our presentation tonight, we are loosely following our actual group dialogue, our actual study dialogue group session structure. And so I've got a slide for that. Big shout out to graphic designer Kristen Leader, my sister, who created these slides. So I'm going to screen share the slide. So this is the structure of our study dialogue groups. And this is approximately the structure of tonight's presentation. So we always start with a land acknowledgement and then opening words, which could be a poem, it could be, a longer quote like Linda did today. And then we always do a check-in, and Linda will go into that in further detail. Then we have a preparing for the conversation, which is a silent reflection. Then we have our open discussion. And then we summarize some of the themes that went on in the discussion. And then we talk about what's next, what the next session of the dialogue group, what the materials will be for that, what they are. And then we have closing words, again, like a poem or a quote.
So this is the time in our group when we do a check-in. And the check-in is when we come together and we make ourselves present for the group. In the first meeting, we introduce ourselves. So in the first meeting, we say for our first meeting, we will check in by sharing our name, our preferred pronouns, how we identify racially, and then share when was the first time you realized you had a racial identity. So Jody and I will do the check-in, and since we've already said our names and our pronouns, we'll leave that out this time. I identify as racially white, although I regret that it has only been in the last several years since I've begun doing this work of looking at myself in the context of race, that I have seen and understood that I myself have a race, that I am racialized, and that there are consequences of that for me personally and for my work.
I ambivalently identify as white, knowing that while people identify me as white, and I have Swiss, German, Irish, English ancestry. Whiteness is a social construct that was created to perpetuate white supremacy. I first realized I had a racial identity when I was in graduate school, and that was about 25 years ago. I read Peggy McIntosh's essay, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, and her list of white skin privileges. A lot of you might be familiar with that. Up until that point, I had been taught to see racism only as individual acts of meanness. I'm actually quoting McIntosh right now. Not in invisible systems conferring dominance on my group.
So the check-in prompts people to get from their head to their heart and begins the group meeting by encouraging people to engage their own personal history and emotional experience around race. We also try to disrupt the usual style of academics introducing themselves with their academic pedigree and affiliations by modeling that ourselves in the group. Each person during the check-in has about 3 minutes to talk. We discourage crosstalk during this time. There'll be time later for more back and forth talking. And this structure supports intentional, reflective communication. It invites everyone to have their voice heard at the start of the group, and it encourages sharing of the space. After the first group meeting, the prompt for the check-in asked participants, "How are you this week? What stayed with you from the last meeting? Did you notice things in your world with a new lens this week?" We ask prompts that help participants really reflect on their experience of taking in the materials in the syllabus, taking in the discussion in the group, and seeing the world in new ways. And we're always mindful that this is not group therapy.
So I'm aware this might seem a little strange because you haven't seen the syllabus yet, and we'll get to that. So you sort of see why all this intentionality. So in our first meeting of the study dialogue group, we tell the participants how we developed this group. So we thought we'd spend a little time doing that right now. And this is our story. In 2014, Linda and I co-taught a clinical seminar for first-year candidates at MIP. And candidates are students in their first year of postgraduate training to become psychoanalysts. So in this class, while the focus was on presenting clinical cases, we decided to make race an explicit part of our clinical seminar. We assigned 1 or 2 clinical readings on race and whiteness, and we specifically invited candidates to talk about their own racial identity as well as that of their patients. We were surprised how readily students took to this focus and really appreciated the articles we assigned. Of course, race had always been present at MIP, in that most of the people at MIP are white. Race was present, but race had not specifically been a topic of conversation to our knowledge in the MIP curriculum for candidates in training to be psychoanalysts. One class will always stand out in our mind, and it took place after Michael Brown and Eric Gardner had both been murdered by police, and the Black Lives Matter movement had taken hold around the country. During that class, one of the candidates presented a patient who was a student at an Ivy League college without revealing anything about his race or class. As the case discussion developed, so the candidate had not revealed this person's race or class. And as the case discussion developed and more details emerged about the patient, the students were then shocked to learn that this young person was from a wealthy background with professional parents and was Black. The candidates had to look at how these details challenged their assumptions and beliefs. After class, 2 of the candidates met for drinks down the street to talk more about the class. Our class was meeting in Central Square, which is in Cambridge, Mass. So while sitting at the bar, they saw on the TV that a Black Lives Matter protest march had started at Tufts University and was coming through Harvard Square. And that's actually where they were sitting. They were sitting in Harvard Square in a bar. So they looked out the window and they saw that the march was passing right by the bar where they were sitting. And so they gathered their things and got up and joined the march to a Black Lives Matter die-in down the street. It was and then they told us about it the next time we all met as a class. So for Linda and I, after seeing the impact this focus on race had on the candidates and seeing the need among mental health clinicians for a place to learn and talk about structural racism and whiteness, we decided to create a study dialogue group on this subject for mental health professionals. We began in the spring and summer of 2017, and Linda and I spent many hours developing our group, reading articles, sending articles and new material to each other, material we had discovered, watching videos, listening to podcasts, hashing out our visions, challenging each other's racial ideas and assumptions, and facing our own implicit white Eurocentric values. Linda went on a road trip to the Deep South, visiting the major civil rights sites. I've reflected on my experiences in racial dialogues and workshops at my Unitarian Universalist Church, where I belong. When we proposed this group, it was something new. It had never been done before, to our knowledge, at MIP, at our institute, and we didn't know what the response would be. Our incoming president at the time, Deborah Dowd, was very supportive and was planning on working with our board of directors to challenge aspects of our organization that perpetuated its whiteness. Under her leadership, and since our creation of these groups, MIP has developed a specifically anti-racist stance, which has included an immigration justice group, a series of MIP community discussions on race, a MIP Reads book project on race and whiteness, and a racial equity task force.
So I'm going to talk now about our purpose in developing this group. But first, I just want to say, I have to credit Jody with bringing the idea of talking about race to the clinical seminar that we taught. I had taught the first year clinical seminar at MIP before and never thought about bringing race into the discussion. And clearly, I mean, race is present because whiteness is a race, but we never really brought it in as something to talk about. So when Jody brought this idea up, and I knew that she had been doing a lot of work herself through her church and personally on race, and I had been doing some reading on my own, I said, yes, let's do it. But it was definitely Jody's wonderful idea. So our purpose in developing this group, we're trying to create a space where mental health professionals are able to have difficult conversations about race and sit with the discomfort together, bearing the stress, guilt, and shame, and continuing to talk anyway. We're trying to undo white supremacist expectations and ways of being, which have been taught and established in our minds as our right. We're trying to expose therapists and ourselves to materials that enable us to challenge our biased ways of thinking and perceiving the world that we grew up with. Members of our groups have asked, well, when they read some of the materials in our syllabus, they say, well, why weren't we taught this growing up? And we weren't taught it because the forces of systemic racism didn't want us to know. And those blank spaces, those absences where a history of brutality and cruelty and greed should have been, were inculcated in our parents and teachers and elders and passed down to us. It's also reasonable to wonder, well, why didn't we ask? Why didn't we notice? And one response to that is that children get the message early on that these questions about history are not welcome. And since many of us benefit from white supremacist policies, we're not inclined to notice or to ask.
Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the structure and curriculum sources for these groups. So to create the structure and curriculum for these groups, we borrowed and adapted formats used in at least two other settings. The first is Tufts University. Linda's husband, Stephen, who teaches at Tufts, was one of the original group members of the Tufts University dialogue group about whiteness. and he generously shared with us the structure and curriculum of that group. The second setting is First Parish in Brookline Unitarian Universalist, my home church, for the past 25 years. And there I helped develop a short-term Waking Up White group with my fellow parishioners. So Linda and I tailored these materials from both of these groups to specifically suit the needs of experienced mental health clinicians. We acknowledge that both these curriculums come from institutions that have roots in colonialism and are mostly white and Eurocentric. We realize that these groups are only but one way to decolonize mental health, by decolonizing the minds of mental health clinicians. We also recognize and appreciate that there are so many other healing methods used by other cultures, such as those discussed by Stephanie Lynn Kaufman and Zoshi Cartland in the RebPsych presentation on liberation psychiatry. If any of you were this was the very first presentation after the keynote of this conference. Both Linda and I learned a lot from that.
Yes, we did. I also want to say that, when my husband became part of this dialogue group on whiteness at Tufts, and this was at the time was a sort of an informal group. It was not something that had been officially started by Tufts, although they now are doing it through the university. But he would come home talking about, he would come home with these readings, these articles, these books, talk about what he was reading, talk about what they were talking about in his group. And I wanted to be in a group myself. So that was part of my motive in starting this study dialogue group with Jody. I'm going to say something here about the rationale for the structure that we use. And we did adapt, as Jody said, we did adapt the structure and the curriculum for our groups to use with mental health clinicians. Many anti-racist workers and writers have invoked the importance and the necessity of white people engaging in a deep process of self-examination. Carmen Lopez, an educator and a citizen of the Navajo Nation, reminds us, this was at a panel of Native educators at Harvard University last fall. She reminded us that doing the work of anti-racism is not accomplished through a workshop, a conference, or group training, but rather through deep engagement with history, with each other, and with ourselves. And this work is lifelong, she says. Yvonne Williams, a Black professor at Vanderbilt University, says that white people need to look closely at both the history of structural racism in the United States, as well as their own complicity in white supremacist culture. And Layla Saad, the Black, East African, British, and Muslim author of Me and White Supremacy, writes, "This is deep, raw, challenging, personal, heartbreaking, and heart-expanding work." End quote. That was a quote from her. And she encourages people to do this with others to process the painful feelings that are likely to come up so they can keep moving forward. And she cautions them to not turn to Black, Indigenous, and other people of color for this emotional labor. Another rationale for doing these groups comes from our sense that in general, white therapists need to be better prepared to work with those who come to us for help, especially people of color, and particularly to become more able to talk about race without becoming defensive or fragile, to use Robin DiAngelo's word. Our study dialogue group structure works by creating a safe, brave space for honest conversations about racial issues we may never get to talk about in the course of daily life. The group allows people to share the hard work of increasing racial awareness, exploring conflicts and concerns, and connecting more deeply to each other. And this works because it all unfolds over time, over several months. It's not a one-shot experience. And because people are speaking at a personal level about their responses to the curriculum materials and to their own experiences with race.
So this might be a good time to talk about the atmosphere that we try to create in the groups. Before COVID, we convened the groups in my home in Brookline, Massachusetts. We invited people to come early for hot appetizers and informal conversation before the formal start time of the group. And this helped people feel warm and welcomed before engaging in the material. This idea came from Rachel Peltz at the Psychoanalytic Institute of Northern California, who told me that she always served food in her own home when gathering people to talk about race. Just before convening the group, we also light a candle in the center of the circle. And this brings people together and creates a space of reflection. It also helps people focus as we enter into the process together. The atmosphere is also impacted by the strength of our relationship, Linda and my relationship, and our process as colleagues, friends, co-facilitators, and participants. That relationship supports the success of these groups in educating and transforming. And so we offer this because if anybody's thinking of doing this in their institutes, in their groups, you know, that the co-facilitators have a good solid relationship makes a big difference. It really supports the success in educating and transforming. So Linda and I come together to intentionally check in before each class, sharing how we're doing that day, what our concerns are, and then going over the structure of the evening. All of this allows for the spontaneity and emergence of vulnerability among the participants. Without that, there can be no transformation.
And now we're going to transition to talking about our syllabus. I'm going to say something, and Jody will put up in a little while our learning objectives and a basic outline of the syllabus. So a note about the source of our materials. People learn about structural racism and whiteness at different times and from different places in their lives and in their careers. We've developed this group, which is experiential and educative, for people who are aware of this history, as well as those who are not, and people who are in different places on that path. People have different learning styles, and so we choose a range of materials. We use a variety of media, articles, podcasts, videos, interactive media, to appeal to the different ways that people learn. Some people learn visually. Some people learn by listening. Some people like to read. So our materials appeal to those different ways of learning. And the sources of our materials vary from online websites like slate.com and christianhegemony.org, to academic and clinical journal articles, to traditional media such as the New York Times, the Atlantic, NPR, and different podcasts and videos. And we explicitly seek out and include materials written by Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So here are our learning objectives. And I will just go over these.
And this is just for this one syllabus, not for the whiteness one, just for the history of use of.
So the first one is that we describe the history of US structural racism in this country, including the Native American genocide, slavery, lynching, convict leasing, immigrant exclusion and incarceration, redlining, the GI Bill, racial profiling in policing, mass incarceration, and the impact of all of these on both people of color and white people. Our second learning objective is that we will identify ways that structuralized, racialized inequities perpetuate a caste system that leaves most people of color unable to access adequate housing, education, medical care, and equal justice. 3, we talk about how the impact of structural racism enters into our clinical work with both same race and cross race dyads. And each group of readings, that is for each session, of the group, we include at least one clinical article about race and psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. And 4, we identify actions that we can take as citizens to disrupt white supremacy and combat structural racism in this country. For instance, people can join standing up for racial justice, attend a Black Lives Matter protest, to call state legislators to pass different forms of legislation, such as the Guaranteed Housing Stability Act in Massachusetts to stop evictions, and to support the Indigenous agenda in Massachusetts by changing the state flag and seal and banning Native mascots and protecting Native American heritage. Now we're going to look at the syllabus.
So our syllabus is like, how many pages long, Linda? Like,
it's like 6, 7, 8 pages long.
yeah. So
we're really giving you a bare bones look at the syllabus, and we're going to take a closer look at just one session, so that you'll get an idea of what it looks like. But we start with the genocide of Native Americans and the taking of their land, and as you can see, we really go through kind of a trajectory, starting with the history of slavery. We talk about emancipation and Reconstruction, and what happened after Reconstruction when laws were passed, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that were ostensibly made to give Black people and former slaves rights, but were in the fine print, there was fine print that made them either unenforceable or actually allowed slavery, forced labor under certain conditions. This leads to convict leasing. We include the Immigrant Exclusion and Incarceration Act as well, and ultimately ends with mass incarceration in modern times. We also look at redlining and the GI Bill, which were, again, other legalized forms of discrimination and exclusion, and that were very much a part of really limiting and really preventing the accumulation of wealth on the part of Black people. And this year we added a last class on the double pandemic of COVID-19 and racial injustice, with a focus on the health disparities experienced by people of color during the coronavirus. So here's a description of one of our first class. And we start with 2 chapters from the book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who is a professor emerita of ethnic studies at Cal State University. And she tells, these chapters tell the history of the United States from the perspective of Indigenous people. And I will tell you that this is not the history that most of us learned in the public schools in this country. The second item is an interactive time-lapse map developed by Claudio Sant, a historian at the University of Georgia. And he developed this map in 2015, which offers a time-lapse version of the transfer of Indian land, actually the theft of Indian land between 1776 and 1887. And he made this map to accompany his book, West of the Revolution, An Uncommon History of 1776. And then the clinical article, or the psychoanalytic article that we read, is The Other Within, White Shame, Native American Genocide, by New York and New Jersey psychoanalyst Sue Grand. In this paper, she describes her experience of loss of innocence as she recognizes the truth about the genocide of Native Americans in the context of the genocide of her own people during the Holocaust. And she uses this experience to make a distinction between toxic shame, which prevents us from facing the reality of what was done to Native Americans. That's on the one hand, and creative shame, which she sees as a form of shame that enables us to see what lies beyond the myth of the vanishing Indian, that is the typical American myth, and move to a position of depressive concern and restorative justice.
Linda, I just thought of something that I don't think we included, which is that we try to have a clinical article, an article specifically for experienced clinicians that's usually psychoanalytic in every session of the study dialogue group.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. All right. The other thing I wanted to say about the syllabus is always evolving and changing. At the end of every at the end of every semester, because this is done through it's actually, we do this as a course. We don't think of it as a course, but we do it as a course. And as with all of our courses, the participants are asked to fill out an evaluation, and we look at those evaluations very closely. And we change the syllabus based on the feedback that we're getting from the participants, and also based on what's happening at the moment or new materials that we are discovering all the time. So now we're going to have our open discussion.
Yeah, so this is just very briefly, the syllabus for the Unpacking Whiteness. And both these syllabuses are going to be available. Flavia is going to post them at the end of our presentation, and it'll be a Google Doc that's available to everybody and anybody, the syllabus with all the links to the different materials. Okay, so now's the time in the group structure that we prepare for our open discussion, the group open discussion. And I'm going to screen share the guidelines for engagement, which we go over at the first session of each group. So, guidelines for engagement: help share emotional and airtime space fairly, speak your truth, speak for yourself, stay engaged, try on new ideas, experience discomfort and expect and accept non-disclosure. Non-closure, sorry. Non-closure, thank you. Non-closure. Moments of silence are okay. What is shared in the group stays in the group. And we always ask if folks in the group want to edit these, add anything, or want clarification. And we also then say that even though we want to make sure that people aren't sharing and sharing stories they heard in the group and identifying people and their stories, we want to keep confidentiality. We want people to share their personal experiences of the group. It helps to be in dialogue with friends and colleagues and family about all these issues and their own personal experiences.
Just spreading the word, spreading the word about what they're learning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So this is, again, you can see how intentional all this is. So this is a time in a group when we prepare for our open discussion. And we've actually found that what we found is giving people a few minutes of silence to prepare for the discussion encourages mindfulness and discourages impulsive reactivity. So first we briefly summarize the materials that were read or viewed for that particular session, whether they're journal articles or newspaper articles or videos. And then we ask for 2 to 3 minutes of silence. We also invite participants to write or draw in the silence as a way to prepare their minds for the discussion. So for tonight, we're going to show you an element from the study dialogue group on the history of US structural racism. And then we're going to take a brief break. So what we're going to show you right now is an interactive map of the Atlantic slave trade. You will see representations of slave ships, ships carrying enslaved Africans crossing from Africa to South America, Central America, and North America. We want you to know that for many, this is hard to watch. We're especially mindful that this may be difficult for African American people whose ancestors were brought here on these ships. For those of you for whom this is too hard to watch, please take care of yourselves and feel free to step away from the screen if you need to while we're playing the video. Okay, so I'm going to screen share. Okay, hold on. I have to do this again. I'm going to stop my screen share and then do this again. Oh, here it is. Okay. Okay. Can you see that, Linda?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to hit play. And you'll look very closely. So in 2015, Andrew Kahn and Jamel Bowie at slate.com created this interactive video called The Atlantic Slave Trade in 2 Minutes. The interactive animates more than 20,000 ship voyages cataloged in the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. These voyages occurred between 1545 and 1860. And you can see the number on the screen. Is the number, is the year. So we're at 1632, 1634, 1635. These voyages, so by the conclusion of the transatlantic slave trade at the end of the 19th century, Europeans had enslaved and transported more than 12.5 million Africans. At least 2 million people did not survive the journey. So on this map, you see the dots. Each dot represents a boat and a journey full of enslaved Africans. The larger the dot, the more enslaved people on board the ship. And I can pause at any time and then click on a dot and get more information about this ship. So I'm going to click on this dot and it tells me this ship is the Fort Amsterdam Tot Cormanchen. So this ship from the Netherlands left Congo North in present-day Republic of the Congo with 539 enslaved people and arrived in Suriname with 503 people. It made 2 journeys between 1686 and 1689 and transported a total of 957 Africans. So we'll keep playing.
Let's see if we can find one that is coming to North America, to the United States.
Good idea. Okay, so here's a ship. This ship is called the Young Margaret from Great Britain. A ship left Gambia with 298 enslaved people and arrived in Maryland with 265 people. So over 65, no, how many people died? 30 people died at least. It made 2 journeys between 1707 and 1709 and transported a total of 495 Africans.
I think in the interest of time, Jody,
Yeah.
I think we should probably,
Okay.
but people can see the dots are, the ships are proliferating as time goes on. There's many more and more sailing.
Yeah, and you can pause it and click on any dot and it gives you more information on each ship. Okay. So different thoughts and feelings might be coming up for you right now. Maybe you're thinking about your own ancestral history. So we're gonna maybe take a break right now.
How many minutes would you like us to take?
Like 3, I guess.
Take 3 minutes.
We'll take a break, and I would encourage participants to use at least part of the time to sit in silence. If you have other things to do, I understand that as well. To sit in silence, though, to just really process the material that was shared with us. And then we'll return at 6:55 p.m. It's 6:52 now.
Okay. Thank you, Flavia.
Mm-hmm. So we'll restart.
So in the group, we usually have about 40 minutes or so to process materials. And tonight we only have about 10 minutes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd say we have to limit it to 10
Yeah.
minutes. And, you know, I just want to say about the video, you know, this video really brings the slave trade to life. I mean, it makes it very real, and that is, it's very difficult to watch. So right now, instead of the deep discussion that we would have with our participants, we want to invite anybody who would like to share their response to the video to do so in the chat. And as Jody said, we'll have about 10 minutes for this. And I think Flavia, you will be reading anything.
I'm monitoring the chat. And I'm also, for those who have typed in questions, we'll be addressing the questions towards the end.
Yes. I can say that for me, every time I watch this video, I'm just struck again. I'm of Portuguese descent on one side of my family, on my father's side, and I did not know until I watched this video about the role of Portugal in the slave trade. I think the majority of the ships that crossed the Atlantic were Portuguese ships, and they were a major player. They started the trade, the kidnapping of African people and bringing them to South America. And it was just shocking to me, and made me look further into the history of Portugal in their colonial and imperial practices.
Thank you for sharing that. Again, personally, this is when we were reviewing the materials before tonight was the first time that I had been introduced to the website. And the same thing has happened each time you show it, which is that my eyes are drawn to a particular place. So you did something that was meaningful to me, where you said, let's look to see at a ship that's going to North America or the United States area, current United States area. And for me, the place that I think about often is Jamaica, because that's the land of my birth. And my eyes are drawn to the number of black dots that go to the Jamaica, Cuban area, all of those large islands in the Greater Antilles. Yeah. And then we click on it thinking about, or seeing actually how many persons who died. And what a project it must have been to really gather the information and be able to report it back to us. Someone else said here in the chat, 2 heavy minutes.
Yes, so, very heavy.
It was 2 minutes that captured a couple different centuries. Another person said, astonishing number of slave ships to South America. So I guess there is some surprise in the number of persons who are going to that part of the world. And the question is, did that change over time?
My sense of that is watching the video, as ships started going to North America, they continued to go to South America. I mean, Brazil was a major site of deportation for the ships, as well as many of the other countries in the Caribbean and South America.
One of the participants is asking for a link to the video to be posted to the chat, because they missed that. They missed that portion of it.
Okay.
Sure. I can do that right now.
Any other reactions from the participants?
Any reactions?
Well, this is where, if there are no more, oh, I think there is another.
One person said, you know, so I'm seeing opposite, people are having opposite experiences too. You know, one person is showing their emotion through tears. I'm not sure what that means for the person. I'm assuming sadness. But another person said that they found the video too abstract. And one of the things that's really difficult about this space, the way that we're doing this, is it's really hard to get into conversation and hear what is behind what people are experiencing and thinking. But I thought it was important to share those two different responses.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when I was setting up the links, I was thinking how impersonal it is in the terms of, you know, ideally we say and have a picture of a person who was on that ship and their name
Mm-hmm.
and their journey, you know.
Mm-hmm. One other person said, I feel a lot of anger and sadness that the humanity and pain of so many people were denied, and the pain and humanity of so many are still denied to them. Really excellent question for the group to process. What institutions represent the modern day slave ships? I imagine this is something that you think about and grapple in your group over time.
Mm-hmm.
What institutions represent the modern day slave ships?
Great question.
Well, a terrible fact is that the ships at that time were covered by banks and other financial and insurance and other financial institutions, and a lot of our financial practices stem from this period of time, such as mortgages and the investment in debt. But the debt was, the property was enslaved African people. Mm-hmm. So there are many links to contemporary capitalism that date back to that time.
Mm-hmm. Some of the other responses in the chat, I guess in response to that question, what institutions represent the modern day slave ships? So you talked about the institutions that backed the slave trade. There was one person that said cages at the border and jails. Another person said capitalism in general and all of the associated systems represent slave ships today.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So
one other important remark that I'm seeing here, especially since we're facilitating this through a medical institution, it says, the person says, in another presentation using the video, we learned that most of the ships had a physician who was involved to keep slaves alive. So the medical profession was deeply engaged in the transportation of slaves.
Oh my gosh. I didn't know that. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So we're going to transition. We're going to close the presentation by doing some closing words.
I also want to just thank everybody for their response.
Oh, yes, sorry. Yes.
Very much.
Yes, and they're still coming in. Thank you all for sharing. So for our closing words, we're going to offer a quote from Shakira Haddock Lazala, who is a I wrote down all these things about her, and I just like, Linda, can you just give a thumbnail about Shakira?
Shakira Haddock Lazala is a psychologist and is training in psychoanalysis herself. She is a a very talented Latinx psychologist. She is also a poet and a writer. And she has she actually has a chapter in a recently published book on liberation psychology, published by the American Psychological Association. And she is our friend and colleague.
Yes. And this quote comes from a paper that she wrote that was published in a recent issue, special issue of Journal of Gender and Sexuality, in which I think it's 9 or 10 Indigenous or Black people of color, women, wrote about decolonizing psychoanalysis and talking back. So this is from Shakira. By centering the margins, straddling the borderlands, and meeting in the space between, we can discover the liberatory potential of psychoanalysis. The Latinx psychoanalysis will be a psychotherapy para el pueblo, por el pueblo. It challenges psychoanalysis to offer multilingual services, to get off the couch and into la comunidad, to truly honor the notion of breaking down defensive walls that reinforce artificial borders. It will not only honor the unconscious, but it will also honor consciousness. It will not only be awake and aware, it will be woke. It will have critical consciousness, social consciousness, and class consciousness. It will be intersectional and post-colonial. It will be in service of liberation. It will not only honor the psychoanalytic foundational technique of free association and its link to free speech as a fundamental human right, it will advocate for multilingual psychoanalytic training and practice. It will be creative and life-affirming. It will be poetry and prose. It will not hide behind neutrality because it will explicitly aim for benevolence and toward standing firmly by the side of the oppressed. It will be human rather than dehumanizing and objectifying. It will be a psychoanalysis without borders. This is the future. The future is now. So that's the end of our presentation.
I think we're ready for question and the Q&A.
Sure. Thank you both for your presentation. Thank you to the participants for sharing their thoughts, emotions, and knowledge in the chat room. We have a few questions here in the Q&A that I think will probably take us to the end of the time that we have together. The first
7:30, right? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. The first question I have here is from Lucia Denegri. First of all, thank you and congratulations for the commitment that your work implies. Those of us who work in the psychoanalytic field know how ingrained racism and classism are in many of our institutions. I want to ask, in addition to personal and formative work to decolonize clinical work, how do you think we can approach the necessary transformation of the psychoanalytic concepts impregnated with Eurocentric, white, and patriarchal conceptions? So this person is asking about the concepts.
This is a great question. And I think it has to happen first with leadership in the psychoanalytic institutes and the other training programs that are teaching psychoanalytic theory. That has to happen first, that the leadership has to be on board with all of this in order for transformation, even at this level, to take place. That was my first thought. Linda, you probably are thinking of something too.
Well, I do think it's a great question, and you know, it's a question that doesn't have simple answers, but I think a place to start is by looking at some of the language that we use in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. A lot of these concepts came from 19th century ideas about colonialist ideas, anthropological ideas, scientific ideas that were just grounded in white supremacy. So ideas about pathology, you know, the word primitivity, I mean, you know, stems from sort of anthropological ideas about non-white people, non-Christian people. We have to look at the language that we use and where it came from and find new words, new language to describe what we're doing, as well as the people that we're working with, because the language alone is just kind of steeped in these, as you say, white and patriarchal and Eurocentric conceptions.
And some of this is already going on. I'm thinking about that special issue in gender and sexuality, and I should get the actual title. But there's an author in there, and she wonderfully writes about Kleinian theory through a non-patriarchal, non-Eurocentric lens. And very specifically, I'll get that reference. I'll put that in the chat. But there are other authors doing that too.
But the other thing that I wanted to bring up to this, with respect to this question, is that there are other models. There are people who are developing new models of psychotherapy that I think are trying to break out of this. And I heard some of this in a different conference on decolonizing psychology. Dr. Carmen Vasquez has created a model of testimonio therapy that she is using with Latinx women, which is a kind of sharing of stories between therapist and client. Other people are using models that really try to break up the fee and pay structure, finding other sources of functioning so that they can offer either free or very low cost treatment or therapy. So there are people who are really trying to do completely, they're trying to sort of pull apart our usual way of doing business.
Thank you both for answering. Another question here is looking at how a proliferation of materials. So we talked about concepts, and I'm coming through clearly, concepts and materials that we could reference and language that we might change. One person is asking, have you written this curriculum into a handbook that other groups can use? I'm curious about how others can use this structure independently. Are you at a to ask maybe one more question before we end, just for you to keep that in mind as you respond.
But you just froze. I don't know if anybody else.
No, I can repeat the question.
Sure.
Yeah. The question is, have you written this curriculum into a book that other groups can use? I'm curious about how others can use this structure in the point, or do you have plans to do a train the trainer model with this concept? And I did want to ask one more question before we end it, so you can keep that in mind as you respond.
Okay, sure. So we have not written this curriculum into a handbook, but Jody, we should probably talk about it. But people are using this curriculum. They're using this structure and this curriculum and adapting it for their own purposes. Somebody who was in our group last year is using it She's doing a workshop, a multi-week workshop in her church group. There is a group, there's at least one group, a Harvard Medical School group that is using this with their staff, with their medical staff. These are people who are will be going to different countries eventually and working with people in different cultures. And they felt that they wanted a way to educate themselves and to do this work, to prepare for that. At least one Boston hospital group has consulted with us about, and we are sharing our syllabus, and people are, I work with people to help them to adapt what we use for mental health clinicians to use with, whoever the participants are, whatever discipline or group the participants are coming from. It can really be easily adapted for other people to use.
So Flavia just shared the syllabuses. They are Google Doc links open to everybody. She just shared that in the chat. I think.
Did you want to add to what I said, Jody?
Well, yeah, and it's easy to share the syllabus. I think it's not so, it takes a lot more time to share the structure and creating the atmosphere, which we tried to do in this hour-long presentation, because that adds to the ability of this to be transformative, this group. And that we haven't concisely put into like a handbook or something where we're in the middle of thinking about doing that. We're not, but the structure is important, and obviously the relationship between the facilitators is important, and the intentionality, all that is important along with the syllabus. And also, doing it on Zoom is very different than doing it pre-COVID when we were in person. Lighting a candle online doesn't have the same effect as being in person.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought all of that up, Jody, because I'd like to just add to that by saying that a lot of what you were just talking about is we create what we call in psychoanalysis a holding environment. And I imagine most of you can understand what that is. This term comes from the work of the pediatrician and psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott. That a holding environment is a sort of something that happens developmentally to children, where they're sort of held in an emotionally nurturing environment. And we do this as therapists, and I think Jody and I do this in our group. We create a holding environment that enables people to do the work of growing and changing and facing these things. And I think that is an important part of it as well. So we would have to find a way of trying to describe that as we sort of pass this along.
Absolutely. So I'm seeing one question. Flavia, do you mind if I?
Go ahead. Yes, go ahead. I was going to ask on the question that Crystal had shared, and
that's what I was going to ask. Yeah, go ahead. You say. Go ahead.
Sure. The question that she shared is, thank you for doing the hard but extremely important work to bring light into these issues. Have you ever expanded topics on racism and bias against other ethnic groups, including Asian or Hispanic groups?
So thank you, Crystal, for asking this question. And this brings to mind our development, both Linda and I, my development as a facilitator of these groups and a development of the curriculum and how it's always changing. And I think every semester we present this, I realize what we're not doing. So for instance, we didn't have anything in the syllabus on the Immigrant Exclusion Act, on the internment, incarceration actually of Japanese people during World War II. That's part of structural racism in the United States. And also the way Chinese people were excluded in this country for many years. And then, of course, you know, what's going on right now at the border, the racism against Latinx people, you know, Central American immigrants. So yes, the answer is yes, we have expanded, but we need to do so much more. And you know, I'm humbly so aware of how much more, and how we don't get it all right. And did you want to add anything more about that, Linda?
Yes, from the focus is on structural racism and whiteness, and we do bring in different readings and other pieces from time to time. I'm remembering that in our first year, we did have we had an article, we had a piece from the New York Times written by somebody who was a writer for the New York Times, and it was an open, and it was published in the Times, and we assigned it. It was called An Open Letter to the Woman Who Told My Family to Go Back Where We Came From. And this was written by the writer, who was out after church on a Sunday morning on the Upper East Side, going to brunch with his family and his children and maybe some other extended family, and a woman just started yelling at them. And so he wrote this letter, and it started a whole dialogue on the New York Times, and it created an important dialogue in our group as well. So we do bring these in from time to time.
Oh, and Steve Knobloch in the chat is referring to psychoanalysis in the barrio, race, class, and the unconscious, edited by Patricia Garavici and Christopher Christian. That's a wonderful book. And there's also a video, a movie that came after Black Psychoanalysts Speak, which was a video about Black psychoanalysis, but this is about psychoanalysis in El Barrio, which that book is taken from, was inspired by. I think it went that way. So yes, there's a lot of materials, and the class is only 6 sessions, 90 minutes each. There's not enough time. There's never enough time to do more.
I think we might actually have time to respond to this last question, and we'll have it there. And I think in some ways you've started responding to it by sharing resources that we may not be familiar with. But Wendy Stewart asked, could you give more examples of psychoanalytical language that is problematic?
Oh, that's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
I would refer, that is a very good question. There are other examples. They're not coming to my mind at the moment. But I would refer you to the book Indigenous Populations of the Mind by Celia Brickman, who has done extensive scholarly work in anthropology, and really looking at the roots of psychoanalysis and the language, and really making direct connections between the language of anthropologists who were, going to places like Samoa and other Pacific Islands and other cultures, and the ways that they were describing the people that they were finding there, through a Eurocentric and white supremacist lens, and then those descriptions were then used. That language was then used in medicine and psychoanalysis, but I'm not. They're not coming to my mind at the moment.
Thank you. As we wrap up, I just want to ensure that it's okay for the participants to use the materials that you've shared, both verbally and the syllabus or parts of the syllabus that you've shared. And if there are any concerns that you have in how or direction that you have for how people might want to use it, if you could share that with us now, that would be really great.
That's a really great idea. So again, the syllabus ideally should be used in the context of a lot of what we talked about in this hour. So the structure, the intentionality of setting the atmosphere, you know, all those aspects. And so I would strongly recommend that people sharing the syllabus with others or using it themselves, you know, maybe go over and I think they're, you know, wonderful transcribers. Christy and Christine are doing, we'll have a transcription because of them. And then so you can go over using the syllabus. I'm just thinking off the top of my head right now, but using the syllabus and also the structure that Linda and I have carefully laid out, and establishing a good solid relationship with your co-facilitator. And we're happy as much as we can, you know, to be available to talk to you about it. If anybody wants to contact us, you know, I'm happy to put my email in the chat, you know, and I'll get back to you if you want to talk on the phone about these groups or doing this. So thanks for that.
I would add something else just to think about is that is the issue of a mixed race group versus a group for white people and a group for people of color. It can be difficult, particularly if there are maybe one or two people of color in one of these groups. It can be hard to listen to white people processing, to learning things that, you know, many people of color know. So that's just something else to think about. Now, if it's a group with sort of a more half and half, you know, people of color and white people, that might be better, because then somebody won't feel like the lone, you know, person of color listening to white people, or feeling like, you know, people are looking to them for the answers. So that's another consideration. But the materials in the syllabus, I mean, people are free to use them because they're in the public domain. You know, they're on, a lot of the materials that we have are on websites, and others are not. But those we don't have links to, and you would have to find those on your own.
So with the minute we have remaining, I did want to reiterate our thanks. Many of the participants really appreciated the effort you have put into creating this curriculum and this work group, and you sharing it and modeling it for us today, and the time that you spent with us this evening. Many persons said so. I think the conversation has picked up nicely. It's too bad that it has to end soon, so I just want to give everyone a warning before we end. Because when the Zoom ends, it just disappears off of your computer, so there'll be no more chatting in the Zoom webinar room. So for those participants who are still chatting, to let them know that. And then if you have any outstanding questions, or if you want to talk more, Jody Leader has generously shared her information in the Zoom webinar chat, so you can reach out to her that way. She shared her email address. Thank you all.
And thank you, Flavia, for your wonderful facilitation.
Thank you, Flavia, and thank you to RebPsych, to all of for offering this Decolonizing Mental Health conference.
I think it has been a great conference so far. I know I'm slightly biased, but it's been really helping to share a number of it shouldn't be groundbreaking, but groundbreaking perspective. So that's been wonderful.
Yes.
So
Yes. And innovative, truly innovative.
tremendous,
Yes.
tremendous.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to stop recording here now, and I'm going to end our session.
Take
All right.
care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.